revolution is brewing, and everybody wants to rule the world. But our founding father, George Washington, the first president of the United States, obviously was not such a man. He was a man who actually believed in democracy. And we've got on the phone with us Richard Lim, who has a wonderful website. It's firstinpeace.com. And it's basically a history of George Washington. And I'm just looking through this, Richard, and I am just amazed at the amount of information you have here on our founding president, our first president, one of the founding fathers, and the relationships he had with the other founding fathers. I find that quite interesting. But one of the things that really I was surprised about was he wasn't that educated a man, was he?
Well, he missed out on a lot of the education that a lot of his fellow, founders had experienced. A lot of people assume that he was born into wealth. To an extent, he was born into a family that did own land, but they were never in the top echelon of Virginia society. So he was kind of an individual who was always kind of right outside the upper crust and had that ambition to always, rise, higher and higher. He missed out on an education in Europe, which his brothers received, and a lot of, young colonials did receive. And so, really, when it comes to Washington, a lot of it is self-made. A lot of it is, by dint of his own efforts to rise up. And, he actually was pretty insecure about his education. And it's interesting because I think when you do read his letters and you read, his speeches and everything, he comes across as a very intelligent man. Of course, when you pit him against people like Jefferson and Madison and Adams, who kind of, made a living out of being intellectuals, of course, he just didn't have that same exact opportunity. Of course, Destiny had other plans for him because while they were, learning the philosophies and studying Locke and all the philosophers, he was out there learning how to lead men, and, that was his station in life.
And of course, his father dying when he was like 11 years old prevented him, as you said, from getting that education. And I find it kind of interesting. At the age of 16, he copied down the 110 the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. And that was kind of his guide to social etiquette and kind of an exercise in penmanship for him. But of course, he incorporated that into his own conduct. And I think that probably had a big influence on his young life and, of course, the man he developed into. But he was also a man of faith as well, right?
That has always been a very controversial topic, and I think you've seen waves of different opinions in scholarship. And I think the recent book that Ron Chernow puts up there, which I read and I greatly enjoyed. There are a lot of books that I've read on Washington. This is one of the best. And it does talk about a lot of evidence that is out there that Washington had a strong faith. Mary V. Thompson is a scholar who probably knows Washington's papers better than anyone. She's quite a resource at Mount Vernon. She's written a book called In the Hands of a Good Providence, which discusses a lot of eyewitness testimony that corroborates a lot of the evidence showing that Washington did have morning devotions. He did pray to himself. I think a lot of times with Washington, obviously, people like to enlist Washington into whatever they can, people, whether they're, atheists or, Christians or whatever. And so a lot of times you get a lot of crossfire in that. You kind of lose the real person. But when you look at a lot of the evidence, it shows that Washington was a man of very deep faith, and he also was very reticent. I mean, people said that if you had dinner with Washington and didn't know who he was, you wouldn't know that he was George Washington. I mean, he just never spoke about himself. And what his adopted granddaughter, Nellie Custis, said was that he was a man of deeds, not words. And so a lot of his actions, you look at his involvement in his church, you look at the fact that he had, he sponsored, sermons, and that he He basically, he really was a man of charity. He gave to charity without anyone knowing, anonymously. And he was very much involved in the religious education of his, nieces and nephews, provided them with Bibles and everything. I think the evidence shows that he was a Christian, but at the same time, it gets difficult to recover that because he just didn't talk about himself. He had that kind of humility.
Well, and another thing that I found out looking at this website that was surprising to me that Martha Washington had actually been married before, and she was a widow.
Right.
And George married her and actually kind of married into a lot of money. So he was kind of a self-made man. He built himself up from his bootstraps, pulled himself up from his bootstraps as a young man. But then he meets Martha. Well, I guess Martha. What was it, Custis at the time?
Yes. Martha Dandridge. Her husband was Custis, so Martha Dandridge Custis.
And so her husband died. He left her with this massive estate that consisted of thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves, and she was also the mother of 2 children. And so George Washington actually was their stepfather.
Exactly. What's interesting is that a lot of people have tried to kind of find out the dirty laundry of George Washington and say, oh, he was a man of many women and everything like that. There's no evidence to suggest that. Of course, the Sally Fairfax thing is something that's been controversial. But I think people who have studied Washington found that he had a very deep sense of duty to his family, to his community. Some people say that the marriage with Martha was part convenience, and of course it didn't hurt that she was wealthy. But at the same time, what you find is that he completely took her children as his own. He was completely faithful to her, and he took up his responsibilities not just to his family, but so many of his nephews and nieces and their kids, basically adopting them. He afforded his stepson Jackie with an education. Paying for him to go to Annapolis and King's College. And he himself had valued that education so much because he didn't get it. Jackie was kind of an indolent child. He didn't really take advantage of what his father had given him, which upset George Washington a lot. But I think what you find, you find a young George Washington who's kind of brash, very ambitious, maybe a little cocksure. But then, when he meets Martha and, settles down, he really becomes a man who focuses on his duty, a man of the community, a family man, and that's what he's always been. And, his mother, Ron Chernow writes a lot about his mother and the fact that his mother was very demanding and unreasonable, but you'd never find any sense that George Washington was abandoning her or neglecting her. He fulfilled his roles and his duties, and that was what I think served him well when he became a public figure.
Well, it's funny that the house that after he got married, ironically, when he moved into that estate, it was the White House in Williamsburg, and then of course they moved to Mount Vernon. But I just found that very interesting. That was a piece of history that I didn't know, and this your website is just full of that. I think Demetrius has a question for you too.
Hey, Richard. Sure. Last year, it may have been 2009, 2010, I actually used the story of George Washington in my sermon to the church.
Oh, okay.
And I can't remember if it was the Battle of Valley Forge, but it was this one particular battle where there was a lot of men that was wounded, and George Washington personally got on horseback and carried those men to the medic to receive the medical attention that they deserve. I don't know what battle that is. Maybe you can help me out there. But I found that to be very inspiring, very uplifted, because he was persuaded to retreat or to surrender, but he didn't. And of course, that story had a lot of spiritual significance to me. But I just wanted to share that with you. That George Washington helped inspire a sermon.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, I think a lot of people forget, they kind of look at, one thing about the revolution is that you look at it and you kind of see a neat progression. You see, the colonies get taxed by Britain. Britain gets, America gets pissed and they start rebelling. They win the war, Constitution, president, and it all just kind of looks like it's a logical progression. And that really masks the fact that it was a very frightening time. It was a very uncertain time. People were dying left and right of battle and disease, and you had a very uncertain war that just oftentimes it looks like the Americans were going to lose. And really, a lot of what people realize, or they don't realize, is that the founders had committed treason, against the most powerful empire in the world. Washington would have been the first man hung in the Tower of London had we lost the war, and he would have been a traitor. And so, when you look at that story, there's a story right before the Battle of Trenton on Christmas Day, the night of Christmas Day, and basically, everything's falling apart. The Americans have been, just destroyed and pushed out of New York. Britain takes over New York City. And they have to strike. Washington has to strike to keep the war going on, and he writes on a paper a code that says victory or death. And that's literally what they are facing, victory or death. And we kind of, you look back again in history and you kind of forget, hey, this was not an inevitable progression of events. I have a friend who once said, oh, Washington wasn't that great. I mean, he was just the first president. Okay, sure, if you look back at history with the view that things kind of happen like they're meant to happen and no one really needs to do anything and things will unfold, sure, you could think that, but you're totally ignoring the context. You're totally ignoring the uncertainties, the fact that none of this was inevitable.
Well, Richard, I'm sorry to cut you off, Tony, but a good mutual friend of ours, Jacqueline, is listening to us from, wait for it, London.
Wonderful. Hi, Jacqueline.
Yeah, and I just wanted to give her a quick shout out. See, Tony, we have people listening in overseas.
Well, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that George Washington actually lost more battles than he won in the Revolutionary War, and of course he was criticized for having a lack of imagination, but it was his courage and his fortitude and his virtue that won, of course, the loyalty of his troops, as you write on this site, and of course ultimately lifted him to the heights of military glory, and ultimately made him a commander without historic precedent. And this is just a fabulous website you have here. Can you stick with us for a few minutes? We've got to take a break. All right, we got to take a break for Fox News here at the top of the hour, so it's going to be more than a few. It'll be like 5 minutes. But I'd like to continue the conversation. Today is George Washington's birthday, and this is extremely interesting to me, and I hope you, the listeners out there, will be back with Richard Lynn from firstinpeace.com right after Fox News. Stay with us right here at 12:30.